Hello and welcome to Pontus Points. This time it's about American democracy and, as you might know, or I guess the entire world knows, it's very, very partisan in the US. You have two parties, they fight like crazy, and this is not taking any stance in that sort of conflict. This is looking at not the two teams playing, but the actual rule of the game. So I'm looking at the American implementation of democracy. And so if you are very strongly in favor of one of the sides, you can still sort of benefit from this because, again, it's about the system. It's not about the parties. Let's take the first picture. So I'm basically going to point out a number of things that I find are rather peculiar in the American implementation of democracy. The first one is, you have normal law and then you have constitutional law. That's sort of a separation you have in all countries across the globe. It's just that the American implementation of constitution is a bit like the 10 commandments handed from God. They cannot be changed. That is, of course, not true because there is a system in place that allows change of the constitution. It's just that it's sort of not done. It's been amended 27 times since 1789. 10 of them were actually in 1789. So it's been changed 17 times over the last 250 thereabout years. That's very, very little. And if you look at the only change over the last 50 years, it is on the important subject of congressional salary. So in the US, in the Constitution itself, Article 5, it takes 2/3 majority to pass any change to the Constitution. And it's been attempted a number of times in thousands of different topics. But it's not been done more than the 27 times, which is really strange if you look at how constitutions are handled in other democracies. So in Sweden we have the system where we have a majority needs to pass a bill, and then there needs to be a general election between, and then the same one needs to be passing again after the election. So two decisions with a general election in between. That gives the opportunity of saying no to like a government that is trying to impose things that the public does not approve of. That's the whole idea about that. But we have 7 pending ones since the last period that should be sort of reintroduced and passed again. And then we will have 7 new changes. And if you compare that is a 4-year period. So if you compare that to the Americans with just one over the last 50 years, we have a much more dynamic view on the Constitution. It's a living thing that needs to be updated on a regular basis to ensure that it keeps sort of current. It should be kind of difficult to change it because it should be like a spine, something you can rely on, but it should also be flexible like a spine so it can adjust to the different situations. It cannot be like a solid piece of rock, because then you're getting into troubles with implementation. You're into interpretation, like interpretation of the Bible or the Quran or that, because you cannot no longer ask the source about the different interpretation. You need to try to interpret stuff that is really old. But here we have, it's legislation. Just change it if it doesn't work. It's fine, you can do it. It's fully up to yourself. So I'm very much in favor of this continuous improvement. If you look at the software industry, that's something we do every day. Toyota calls that system Kaizen, gradual improvement to make it better over time. All right, so the next thing is that democracy should start from the people. That's the Greek word demos. And the ambition must be to ensure that you have the maximum attendance in the election. You want everybody to cast their vote to ensure that the foundation of everything is with the full population, not just a selected few or a small portion of the population. You want it to be rooted in the general population. But here in the US, you have pre-registration and you have elections on a normal workday, whereas in most other democracies, the pre-registration process, either it's automatic or it's done very easily. And you have election as a public holiday. So people will have the opportunity of showing up and casting their vote on the workday. If you really want people's participation, then those are logical things to strive for. But that's not done in the US. The ambition doesn't seem to be that everybody should be able to participate in the elections. The next one here, representation. So democracy, again, is the representation of the people, and the actual representation is also relevant here. If you look at the US and also the UK, you have this majority selection, and here the constituencies, they are selecting one individual. So you're making constituencies that are so small that it will only have like one representative. And that means that you can have somebody who is a very strong minority representation of the general population that is actually selected, which doesn't make sense. You would like the majority of the population representing the ones that are in power. Otherwise, there is something skewed with the system. If you win by a very, very slim margin in a few or a large number of the constituencies, and then you lose big in the rest, you would actually have a minority, and you would still have a majority. You have a minority of the population, but you have a majority of the selected officials, which doesn't make sense. So my general view is that, and also here, I tend to compare democracy with market economy because the basis is sort of the same. You have the general population, they have their assets. In the market economy, it's their money, and in the democracy, it's the vote that is sort of the currency that the population can pay with. And when we look at market economy, we tend to want a number of players. We don't want monopolies, which would be the equivalent of an autocracy here. And we tend also not to have too few participants on any given market, because that would be an oligopoly or a duopoly, or that's also a very, very special market dynamics that is less favorable for the consumers. So that's why we don't want it. And my assumption here is that the view on democracy would be something similar. You would like to have more players than two participating, because otherwise, it's just a tug of war between two parties. You would like to have alternative views to ensure that parties could be more aligned with your particular views, like in market economy. So if you have too few, the market dynamics doesn't really work. And if you have too many, you might see that could be a bit of a chaos. If you have 20 parties that need to negotiate and form government, that's a big mess, and you have that in many countries, so you don't want that. So I'd say the optimal thing is to have constituencies which select a number of representatives, and then you also have like a threshold, so the lowest possible number of votes you get or that is the minimum requirement for being represented in parliament should be let's say 3 to 5% of the votes or something in total. If you are below that, you are one of the long tails, and it's okay to cut off the long tails. But in general, I'd say like 5, 6, 7, 8 parties, something like that makes sense from a democracy point of view. The other part of representation here in the US is that given the two houses, the Senate is giving an abnormally large influence to the geographic areas, so the states. If you look at California, you would have one representative in the Senate per 20 million inhabitants, thereabout. Don't pick the numbers like on decimal. I think it's like 38 million in total, which means that, so it's 19 million. But let's round it to 20. In Wyoming, having like 500,000 or 600,000 inhabitants, you have one senator per 300,000 inhabitants. That is almost 1 to 100. So if you look at the relative weight of people in Wyoming, it's 100 times stronger than the relevant or relative influence of people in California. It's absolutely fine to weigh the rural area a bit more so that they are not forgotten. But weighing them 1 to 100, isn't that pushing it a bit to the place where it's no longer like properly representing the general population? Okay. Secrecy of vote. This is something which is also super strange for foreigners. So the US is built on the general principle that you cannot trust the state. If you look at the Second Amendment, and I know that's a controversial part, I'm not going to take the controversial part, but the aim of that, what that one states, is that you have the right to form a militia. And basically the ambition of that is to overthrow a government that turned rogue. Okay. So you are saying that everybody should have weapons to ensure that the government could be overthrown if they can no longer be trusted. But when you select a president, in order for that system to work, the selection of president is handed to the government. So government actually does that. It's not the parties that nominate and handle the administration for selecting their representative, who they are going to put forward as a candidate for the presidency. No, that's actually done by the state, pretty much like it's done for the actual president selection. But in order for that system to work, you register your affiliation with the state. So let's assume for a second that the state actually goes rogue. And you have provided the state with a list of potential opponents. If you are from party X, you have a list of everybody in party Y. So if you would like to start shooting your political enemies, there is a list. In most other democracies, like all of them, only parties keep lists of their members. That's not public information. That's not something somebody outside the party normally could get access to. So it's really, really strange that you are having public list of affiliation of political parties. That is very much not how normal democracies work. And then one of the other things is efficiency. There are very few countries that still entertain the idea of two houses because it becomes a mess. You need to have every bill pass both houses, which means that you need to convince two sets of people. And convincing one set of people is difficult enough. This is no longer a current standard in basically any countries. Okay, there are, of course, two-house systems, but this is something that most countries have abolished because it's such a nuance. It just adds to the complexity. Everything becomes more cumbersome and the political system becomes less efficient. And you don't want the political system to be that inefficient. It's okay that it takes a bit of time so you can actually think before you act, so you don't act on trends and stuff that's just current for a very short period of time. But you should be able to act. If you have two houses, the probability that you would act at all is diminishing. Yeah, so will this change? Very likely not, because it's handled like the Ten Commandments. They are handed by God, so the founding fathers are like the political gods, and there is interpretation of what they said, and any new thoughts tend not to be implemented in constitutional law in the US. So, I'm sorry, it's a bit disturbing to see the general political status of the US. It's supposed to be like the leader of the free world and the champion of democracy, but it's the champion of democracy with sort of the least working democracy. So the US, please get your acts together. Have a look at these points and see if anything could be changed to modernize your democracy into something that works a bit better than it does today. So you need to stop the partisan tug of war, because that is not going to benefit you at all. Introduce more parties by changing from the majority system, and stop the silliness of gerrymandering. That's also one of the things that should like go away if you change the constituencies to ones where there are more representatives than one in every circle. So do change that, and I think the American democracy would work better. Bye bye.